Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. While we often focus on the impact of migration on Australia, little attention is paid to the reverse impacts, the way migrants maintain connections to their countries of origin and how these manifest. One of the migrant groups that maintained strong links with their homeland was the 100,000 or so Chinese migrants who came to Australia during the colonial and Federation eras. Joining me to discuss the China-Australia migration corridor is archaeologist Professor Denis Byrne from Western Sydney University. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Denis.
Thanks, Georgina. Good to be here.
It's lovely to have you on. I think you are our first archaeologist and I understand heritage study expert, but first archaeologist on Afternoon Light. Normally, I always consider archaeologists in digs in, some ancient Greek ruins or Egyptian or Roman or, even in ancient Australian sites. But you are looking at much more recent history, 19th century, 20th century history. So tell me about how the study of archaeology helps in the study of modern history that we're talking about today.
Good question. I'm certainly not a dirt archaeologist, as we say. You could tell that by looking at my fingernails, probably. But that's my disciplinary background, and I certainly spent time in trenches digging things up. But over the last decades, there's been quite a strong movement to bring an archaeological perspective, and I would say an archaeological sensibility to the more recent past, and even, in fact, the contemporary past. So there is a whole field of scholars who work in that area now. And I think it's part of a much broader shift in the humanities and social sciences to pay much more attention to materials and the materiality of the world we live in and what things can tell us that, say, history books necessarily, or documents and archives. So it's, in a way, it's a tuning in to the built and unbuilt environment around us.
It's interesting. I sort of think of it as heritage studies. So, you study, for example, the architectural history of Melbourne, where I live, and how Heritage Victoria lists particular buildings for their architectural significance or their significance to a community, or a particular person lived there or a business was located there and the like. So when does heritage studies become archaeological studies?
Well, there's no dividing line really yet, because a lot of people working in the heritage field are, in fact, archaeologists. And of course, whenever an old building in a place like Melbourne or Sydney is demolished by developers, archaeological excavations have to take place in that space before you can build a new building. So the two are very closely entwined. But in the case of the project we're talking about today, the China-Australia migration corridor, the archaeological perspective there, probably mainly concerning the fieldwork we were doing in China itself. It was very much a matter of examining and interrogating buildings that were built with money that was sent back to this area and Zhongshan County in southern China by Chinese people living and working in Australia. Most of them were men up until later in the 20th century.
So tell me about these Chinese migrants to Australia, Den. There are about 100,000 who arrived between 1840 and 1901, which I assume was mainly for the gold rush in that period, because, of course, we were in a time of white Australia before it was legislated at Federation, but, of course, white Australia after Federation as a formal policy. So it would have been pretty difficult, I would have thought, to migrate to Australia or come to Australia during that time as a non-white, which, of course, these Chinese migrants were.
Certainly after the white Australia policy comes in 1901, it became extremely difficult. But in the period before that, from, say, around the 1840s and 1850s, and period of the gold rush and so on, it was much easier. So what happened with the gold rush of course, is that some people struck gold, made good, and many didn't. So some of those Chinese men went back to China with the money, with the gold, literally in many cases with the gold, taking the gold back. But many stayed on and became market gardeners, shopkeepers, furniture makers, and other kind of settled down, raised families here. Many met white Australian women and formed relationships with them. So many of those people really did settle in Australia, and their ties with their home villages sort of diminished over time. But many continued to relate very strongly to their families at home. And here we're talking about extended families rather than
just mum and dad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they continued to be in very close contact. It's surprising the number of people who actually went back on visits, on initially sailing ships and then steamers, spending a few months or even a year or two back in their home villages, and then returned to Australia and continued on.
It's interesting. The narrative of migration to Australia is almost always you come to Australia and then you never leave, and you stay here and you marry, have children, they have children, they have children, they have children, and then that's it. This sort of idea that you're toing and froing, we're not familiar with, at least that narrative. I mean, when you think about modern life, of course, people come and go the whole time. Planes coming from India are full of migrants from India, but planes going back to India are full of the migrants from India who are visiting home. I mean, that's half of the cause. But I'm interested, obviously we had the gold rush in mid-19th century, which lured thousands upon thousands of people from around the world, but obviously a significant number of Chinese migrants. But were they from this particular community, Zhongshan, in the Pearl River Delta in southern China, or were they coming more broadly from across China? Do we see the Chinese migration to Australia as very much from one place, one source?
They were coming from southern China, primarily from Guangdong and Fujian, but mainly from Guangdong for the gold rush. And there were a number of counties in Guangdong, which are quite close to the Pearl River Delta. So Delta, kind of towards the end of the Delta, you have Macau and Hong Kong. So the counties surrounding that, many of them sent many people to the gold rushes. But within those counties, you would have 50 or 60 villages with their agricultural lands around them. And from certain villages, people went to the gold rush or migrated to Australia for other reasons, and certain villages didn't. And some villages sent lots of people to Hawaii or Cuba, other parts, South America, Canada, the US. When we were doing fieldwork in Zhongshan, people would talk about particular villages as being like a Hawaiian, that's a Hawaiian village, and over there you've got an Australian village.
Was there something about the villages that sent people to Australia that made them distinct, or it was just word of mouth and their neighbour had gone, so they'd heard about it and then they decided to go, and sort of that kind of contagion effect but in that localised area?
The villages themselves tend to look pretty similar, but it's the history of them that people are referring to. It's widely known that families from particular villages sent lots of people to Hawaii or to Canada, other places. And you've got this, for our purposes, we talk about this corridor, the heritage corridor between Australia and Zhongshan County. But in fact, it comes down to a village level where there are very strong sort of links and continuous traffic going backwards and forwards between, say, a place like Sydney and a particular village in Zhongshan, and that included objects going backwards and forwards. So you have this flow of people, ideas, money, a two-way flow.
And that's the fascinating thing that you've identified, isn't it, Denis, that this wasn't just the export of people from certain villages in southern China to Australia and that was the end of it. There was actually a bringing back of what they discovered in Australia or funds they've made in Australia and the influence of that back home as well as, of course, in Australia. But talk to me about this concept heritage corridor, because I think it's a really interesting one and worth unpacking and giving, I think, people a bit more of an idea of the migrant experience in Australia, more broadly than just China as well.
Yeah, the corridor concept actually came to us from the banking sector, of all places, where bankers commonly refer to remittance corridors, like the remittance corridor between the Philippines and Hong Kong, for example. And what they're referring to is the flow of money from Hong Kong back to the Philippines. So there are maps which show these remittance corridors across the globe going from the wealthier countries to the poorer countries. So we adopted the term corridor from there, partly because remittance flows were so important to our work, the fact that so much money was being sent back to China from Australia. But our object was to critique and analyze the way that Australia's heritage is defined as being what is within Australia's territorial boundaries, when clearly these houses in the villages of Zhongshan, which were built by migrants in Australia with the money they sent back, it's hard not to think of those houses as being part of Australia's heritage, at least for somebody like myself. When you think about it, those houses are the crystallization of the labour those people exerted in Australia. The houses were thought about here. They were dreamed about, what the house would look like. They were planned here. People laboured for the money to be sent back. So really, from an archaeological point of view, even, I would say those houses are elements of Australian heritage. But of course, they're in China, so they're also part of China's heritage of overseas migration. Chinese various levels of government are very much interested in them from that point of view, and they're subject of heritage conservation and so on. So it's really not a question of whether they're Australian or Chinese, not some kind of a tug of war who owns these things. In a sense, these places exist in a transnational space, which is outside the whole nation-state frame.
It's a very interesting thought that these are, as you say, these are buildings, for example, funded by money earned in Australia, sent from Australia back to China. The concepts of some of these houses, I guess the design is conceived in Australia. Do you see in these houses Australian elements or influences of our building practices, of natural environment being symbols used in some of these buildings, or is it simpler than that?
Interestingly, certainly architecturally, you don't see direct influence. At least, I haven't been able to detect that. Certainly inside the houses, there are objects from Australia, which might be a suitcase or pictures, postcards, that kind of thing from Australia. We were working in a village one day, we were speaking to descendants of a man who migrated to Queensland and really ended up spending most of his life in Queensland. And he sent back and brought back on his return visits a number of objects. And his relatives sort of went away and came back with this cardboard box, which was full of slightly rusty old tools, including woodworking tools. So there were drills, hand drills, and planes, wood planes, chisels, and various things like that, some of which actually had the Australian manufacturer on them. And he had brought them back, presumably because it was difficult to get things like that in China. He may have brought them back to do some work on the house that he'd built there.
And was there a sense, Denis, amongst these Chinese migrants that moving to Australia was basically a temporary state of affairs? Because you see that often with remittance workers around Asia. They go somewhere, earn money for 5, 10, 20 years, sending it back home. And then eventually when it comes to retirement or different life stage, they'll return home. So it was never a permanent move. Is that the phenomenon you observe with this Chinese heritage corridor?
I think so, yes, I do think so. And I think that actually probably applies to most migrants then or today, that people don't actually imagine spending the rest of their lives in another place. For many people, there is the idea that this is temporary in some way, that we'll make money and will eventually go back. But in the case of the Chinese in southern China in the mid-late 19th century and early 20th century, it was part of what has been called a household strategy, a kind of a household economic strategy where working age males would be kind of sent to places like Australia. I don't mean unwillingly, but in a sense, their labour was exported to places like Australia on the understanding that they would send, in fact, most of the money they earned back to the family at home, which in most cases they did, again, quite willingly, because it was impossible for them to feel that they did not continue to be a vital part of these families back home. I was actually at a seminar last week and somebody said, probably for all migrants, the primary motivation is to have a better life, to achieve a better life. And I'm sure that's true, but the better life is not necessarily located in the destination country. It's very often located back in the home country. So they see themselves as temporarily sort of resident in another place.
And what proportion of these migrants did end up just being temporary? Was it 50%, 80%?
I don't actually know the statistics on that, Georgina, but I would say at a guess, probably around half, something like that, that half of them ended up returning permanently. But there's a lot of kind of leeway in there because many of those people actually stayed here for decades and then eventually retired back in their villages. Some only stayed for a couple of years and then went back. And there are lots of different aspects to this, including, for example, men who are able to bring their wives to Australia, who were normally from the same county and had children here, or people who had children with white Australian women. They very often sent those kids back to Zhongshan County to go to school for a couple of years, for example, so that they would learn the local language, not just Cantonese, but the local dialect of Cantonese. That was a real priority because if they saw these children as doing some kind of business, going into some kind of business later in life, that would involve China, like some kind of trading business.
It's interesting hearing you reflect on their experiences. It doesn't sound like these migrants ever saw Australia as truly home, did they? It was a means to an end of improvement of your economic conditions or your family's prospects.
Well, I think clearly some of them quite a few of them ended up staying here. We know that. They're kind of settled and their descendants are still here. So they became attached to Australia. Presumably later in life, they began to identify as Australian, although white Australia didn't encourage people like Chinese to identify as Australian.
And was that a problem, do you think, for these Chinese migrants, that the reception they received from white Australians was pretty hostile? There was a fair degree of racism, which led them to think, well, this isn't a long-term prospect for us. We'll get what we can out of the country and then head back home eventually.
Yeah, I think so, certainly. They experienced continuous hostility, really. On another project, working with a former PhD student who worked on this project, Christopher Cheng, who's been looking at records on market gardens in Parramatta and at press reports of Chinese market gardeners being robbed or harassed or assaulted by white people in Parramatta, very often by young males who would steal from them, take things from their gardens, steal from the carts that they were driving around selling their produce and so on. And you really get the sense that there was a kind of a level of hostility that was sometimes very overt, but was kind of always there as a sort of an underlying thing. It didn't apply to every white person, and there are lots of stories of close relationships forming. But certainly that negativity towards them, which is obviously racist, was there and discouraged people from thinking of themselves as Australian. To what extent that influenced the people who left and sort of went back permanently to China, I don't know, but it was always there.
Tell me some of the other things that the remittance money went towards that Chinese migrants in Australia were sending funds back for. Obviously, the houses, that there's some interesting, I think, anecdotes you've recorded about how masonry tower houses were erected because the remittance generated wealth of the immigrant villages attracted gangs of bandits, and so they needed to really reinforce their buildings because they were doing so well back in Australia, which is really interesting. But what were the other things they were funding?
Well, very often there were modern things. So sewing machines, things like Singer sewing machines, that sort of foot pedal mechanism. Bicycles were big. So quite often when these men went back to their villages, and they would go via Hong Kong because that's where the ships sort of went. Quite often they'd buy these things in Hong Kong, the sewing machine or the bicycle and other modern things like that, and carry them back to the village. So very much this kind of symbolic homecoming with your wealth sort of surrounding you and all the prestige that would go with that. But the houses themselves, from the earliest houses that were built with money sent back from Australia, were just very similar to the traditional village houses, sort of quite small, single-story, gabled roofs. Gradually, the houses over the next couple of decades become larger, and some of them have mezzanine floors. So there's more space and paintings under the eaves on the outside of the house in traditional sort of styles. Then you get larger houses again, which are two-story, and they start to have windows in them, exterior windows, which traditional houses never had. And the windows have glass, so they are the glass wooden-framed windows. And the windows allowed light to come into the rooms, whereas previously the traditional sort of rooms were very dim. And that allowed, all sorts of modern activities like reading, for example. So literacy was becoming quite common around the late 19th, early 20th century. And sewing, making clothes, including modern clothes. Why I emphasize the modernity of these things, including the houses themselves, is that the migrants themselves, the very fact of traveling internationally, sort of identified you as modern. And this is a period in China where there's a real emphasis on joining the modern world, having a modern economy. And it's partly to do with China being able to stand up against the Western powers' encroachments. But it's also part of this whole thing about a new world expanding around you, and you want to be part of it.
Was money from Australia going to fund the nationalist government or the communist? Was there a sense that Australian dollars, or it wasn't dollars back then, it was pounds, wasn't it? But Australian money was going into political causes back in southern China?
Absolutely. And there were nationalist scholars and activists from China who came to Australia in the early decades of the 20th century to promote the cause of nationalism in China. And people did donate. And there were organizations in the big Australian cities that were also collecting funds for the nationalist movement.
And did that raise concerns amongst the Australian government or Australian government officials that Australians might be somehow involving themselves in these nationalist causes throughout Asia?
I don't think so. I'm not
of it.
I'm not an historian of that period, but it's certainly something that will have been examined. Off the top of my head, I would think not necessarily. I don't think Australia would have been opposed to the idea of a republic, of a Chinese republic. The Chinese Communist Party, that would be a different kettle of fish, I imagine. There would be some
yes,
misgivings about that.
Yes,
but I think most of the money, most of the donations was to the Kuomintang and the communists.
Tell me about the Australian influence on the development of Chinese department stores. This is quite a story, I think. I didn't realise this until I was reading your research, just how much we had an impact on Hong Kong department stores, for example.
Yeah, it's very well known amongst certain people, but certainly not the mainstream, I don't think, in Australia. So in the late 19th century in Sydney, there were lots of market gardens and other Chinese men who were retailing and wholesaling fruit and vegetables in Chinatown, the Haymarket in Sydney. And one result of that was that some of these people would get together and form collectives. And so in the late 19th century, the Wing Sang company was formed by several of these people who had done quite well in fruit and vegetable wholesaling, including the banana industry, which included importing bananas from Fiji, from plantations that these men actually ran in Fiji. They formed this company, and after a couple of decades, by about 1900, they had sufficient wealth that they were kind of looking around to think about where that could be invested. And at the same time, so the story goes, the Anthony Horden department store, which was this huge department store in Sydney, quite close to Chinatown, it occupied an entire city block. It was about 6 stories high. They would go to this department store and they were kind of impressed by not just the building and what it was selling, by the way that goods were displayed, for example, and the goods had prices on them. You didn't have to haggle over the price. It was a whole different way of retailing. And you had shop assistants who would walk around and who would help people out. And apart from anything else, these department stores were full of modern things, from fountain pens and wristwatches to hats and dresses and so on. What they basically did was take that concept initially to Hong Kong and establish a department store there along these same lines with shop assistants, fixed prices, displays where the goods were displayed in cabinets and so on, even in the shop window. And they were a huge success. Principally, I think to begin with, among better off Chinese in Hong Kong who had the money to spend. And not only that, they were attracted by the sheer modernity of this thing and the lifestyle. These places often had gardens on the roof of the building where there would be tea room and so on. So you could go to these places to socialize. And before long, they were building department stores in Guangzhou, Shanghai, and other Chinese cities. It was a booming industry.
Denis, what made this development of the department store in Hong Kong and then more broadly throughout southern China and a sort of an Australian-generated phenomenon and not a British-generated phenomenon or a US-generated phenomenon? Are you not seeing the migrant flows bringing back the same sort of ideas? I mean, I just think of Harrods, Fortnum and Mason, Saks, Fifth Avenue, those sorts of Bloomingdale's. They're all around. Why was Australia's Anthony Horden department store particularly inspirational here?
I think it was partly just an historical accident. These people, these men had the capital at that particular moment in time, and they saw an opening. Nobody else was doing it in Hong Kong at that time. And I guess at some point, somebody just thought, what if we built one of these things in Hong Kong? Would it work or wouldn't it? I imagine that was sort of quite a risk in a way. It could have just been a total failure. But It took off. And I think that what happened then was these families quickly dominated the department store industry in China. They just cornered the market. And it would have been difficult for anybody else to get in from other countries, Bloomingdale's, for example.
Too late, Yankee.
Yes.
Tell me, in 1901, Australia formally introduces the White Australia policy. It's a first act of federation. What impact does this have on this Chinese migrant corridor? Does it dissipate and the flow of migrants and therefore remittances sort of dry up? Is it a casualty of White Australia?
Well, to begin with, the Chinese population in Australia declined by around 50% as a result of that policy. And that was partly because people couldn't bring their family members to Australia. So most of the men who got married, the Chinese men who got married, did so on visits back to China, or they had a wife and children in China before they migrated. It was a really important thing for them to be able to bring family members here. And the new immigration policy made that extremely difficult. If you were living here and you wanted to go back on a visit to China, you could obtain a certificate signed by the local JP and so on to guarantee that you're a person of good standing. So that was a re-entry certificate, which meant that they could come back. And some managed to bring relatives from China, and people who had established businesses like the Chinese stores in country towns across Australia, they often got permits to bring shop assistants from China to work in their shops, who were generally part of their extended family in China. So there were exceptions, but it had a major impact, the new immigration policy.
We see, of course, popularity of Australia very much amongst international students these days, and has really been, I'd say, for 20 or so years. Certainly not a new phenomenon. Do you see a modern manifestation of the Chinese migration corridor through the numbers of international students coming from China to Australia and then going back and influencing their homes with what they've brought from Australia and the like?
Yeah, I think you can. I think there are elements which are quite similar, one of which would be the whole phenomenon of chain migration, where in the old days, somebody from a village would go to Australia and word would get back, or they would come back and say how fabulous it was.
Let's hope so.
Yeah, so other people would be motivated to go. And once they got to the destination, that person and other people from the same village would be there to help them out. So I think something a bit similar applies in the case of international students. And I think, there's probably that similar phenomenon where the areas that students live in Australian cities, they kind of become the familiar map of their conception of what a place like Melbourne or Sydney is. And, particularly because of social media, those precincts of Australian cities become extremely familiar in certain parts of India and China, for example, more familiar than they would be to most people in Australia.
Yeah, I think of international students here at Melbourne University. They often live in the CBD, which isn't a place that many multi-generational Australians would live. And so their kind of conception of what Australia is like, Australian cities are like, is different from yours and mine, for example. And then the image they're portraying, as you say, through their experiences here and what they're bringing back is also a different image than the one we would say, oh, this is the quintessential Australian way of life, Australian city. Yeah, there's a disconnect there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Social media itself has revolutionized the whole experience of migration. I'm sure you've probably had the experience of hopping into a taxi and the taxi driver is on the phone to a relative in India or China and continues to be through the whole taxi ride. Yes. And you kind of get the sense that this person is kind of half here and half there. And I think people are continually sending photos of themselves back or chatting outside a particular building. So the immediacy and the constancy of that transnational kind of connectivity has very much changed things.
Yeah, something one historian of immigration told me was as much as Australians demanded new migrants assimilate into Australian society in the 40s and 50s and 60s, in actual fact, it wasn't just a one-way street. Australians were also assimilating to a community that was more multicultural than it had been before. So we both changed through those interactions. And as a new Australian, you change based on what you see around you, but what you're sending back home is also part of that communication.
And I think some people in Australia some white Australians were more open to that than others. I think that was the case from the 19th century, and it's certainly the case today. Some people are sort of very interested in the fact that somebody comes from a different place, speaks a different language, has a different culture. Other people clearly find that threatening, but there have always been people who have engaged in that way. And of course, all migrants are not the same either. And there were Chinese migrants here in the 19th century who were clearly extremely outgoing and quickly made friends and business contacts with white Australians, whereas some of the others worked on market gardens where they lived in a hut on the market garden for decades and decades and seemed to have, little or no kind of social connection with the population around them.
And that's just the diversity of the human experience,
so.
Isn't it? It's hardly to do with one nationality or the other. Denis, thank you so much for bringing the China-Australian migration corridor in its archaeological and heritage aspects to the Afternoon Light podcast. It's been absolutely fascinating and illuminating discussion.
A pleasure to talk to you, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.